right, let's talk about now. I've talked about kind of things that maybe we want to avoid. Now let's talk about things that research has showed might be effective in being able to get accurate, truthful information. So we're going to talk a little bit about rapport. There's been a lot of focus more recently on rapport in investigative interviews. Rapport, there's lots of definitions of it. One definition in particular that I like is that it is a complex and constant dance between interrogator and suspect. Unlike forced and spurious conversation, rapport is based on mutual respect, and fostered by treating suspects with dignity and humanity. Now, why might rapport be important in investigative interviews? The interview is a dyadic exchange, meaning this task conducted by these two people who must exchange information. It requires a mutual understanding and desire to participate in this task. And people may be more likely to participate when they feel comfortable and feel this rapport with the interviewer. Rapport is not considered to be a specific interrogation or interview technique. Rather, it is something that's supposed to lay the foundation for a successful interview. It induces within the source an internal pull to cooperate rather than an external push from the interrogator. Some people call it necessary but insufficient for a successful interview, and that you have to have it, but you also have to have other things, other elements, other effective interviewing skills to get a successful outcome. We saw earlier that all those law enforcement training methods talked about rapport building. Unfortunately, we see that a lot of these things will talk about rapport building, but not really talk about specifically what exactly you're supposed to be doing to build rapport and how you know if you have rapport. Police officers and intelligence personnel tend to almost universally recognize the importance of rapport and report using rapport building during interviews and interrogations. We could distinguish between the function of rapport in witness interviews and suspect interviews. When we have a cooperative source, the goal is to get the witness to remember and convey as much information as possible. So rapport is intended to help them feel comfortable enough to accurately remember the maximum amount of information. With a non-cooperative source, the goals are to both overcome resistance and also to get them to remember accurately. So rapport is initially used in these cases to lay the groundwork for social influence strategies that could be used to overcome resistance. So here's one model of rapport that's cited a lot, is Tickle, Dignan, and Rosenthal. They say we have three elements of rapport. Mutual attentiveness, the source and the interviewer have to pay attention to each other, that they have to have positive feelings toward one another, and that they have to coordinate. In other words, they're engaging in this task of conducting the interview and getting information. They have to be coordinated in that effort in order to be able to get the information that we need. Now this theory is based on rapport in interpersonal relationships. We know in an interview, the interviewer is not going to have good feelings about the source often. And so this may not really apply there. When we're talking about rapport in an interview, we're talking more about instrumental rapport. We're using rapport for the purposes of getting this person to give us information. So my colleague and I developed another model of rapport. In this model, the rapport process starts with rapport building behaviors. The interviewer engages in behaviors to build and maintain rapport. Maybe by having positive verbal and nonverbal behaviors toward the source. Then these behaviors develop in the source a positive perception of the interviewer. They come to perceive the interviewer in a positive light. maybe they're thinking if they're trustworthy or respectful or competent. And then because of this positive perception, they would be more likely to communicate or cooperate in the interview. And of course, we see that this rapport building behavior can directly affect cooperation, but also can affect it through their perception of the interview and the interviewer. Now, one of the things we did based on this model is develop a measure of rapport. So we have a bunch of questions that we can ask people about their experience of rapport during an interview. And this measure has a number of scales because we think rapport can exist in five main different ways. That the source trusts and the source believes the interviewer trusts and respects him or her. The source believes the interviewer was attentive. The source believes that the interviewer was expert and competent in conducting their job. The source believes that the interviewer and the source are similar culturally and ethnically, and that the source feels like there's a real connection with the interviewer, that they got along together, that they communicated well, they worked together as a team. And this here is the source's perspective of how committed they were to provide information and cooperate during the interview. The idea is that these measures of rapport would impact their perception of their own cooperativeness. So this measure of rapport, we found that we conducted a research study where some people were interviewed using a rapport building interview, other people were interviewed using a neutral interview, and other people were interviewed using an interview where there was a lot of interrogator pressure. People who were in the rapport building interview gave higher ratings on this measure of rapport than people in the pressure interview. So there's been a lot of research on the effect of rapport building on interview outcomes. I shouldn't say a lot. There's been some, not enough yet. Several analog studies have found that rapport building increases source talkativeness, and then it might also improve their memory and make them resistant to misinformation. However, there have been other studies that have shown that there's no effect there. One field study was done where people who had confessed to a crime were interviewed about their interrogation. And of these people who provided this true confession, more of them said that they were interviewed using a humanitarian or rapport building approach than a non-rapport building approach. And then there was another field study done where they reviewed interviews of criminal suspects in England, and they found a strong relationship between rapport building skills and interview outcomes. Here was one study, another study done on these interviews of criminals in England. And what they found is that what was important was not just that rapport was developed at the beginning of the interview, but that rapport was maintained throughout the interview. So many of these manuals talk about at the very beginning, you develop rapport. There was only one in particular that talked about maintaining rapport throughout the interview. Okay, so how do we build and maintain rapport? So according to the cognitive interview that we'll talk about later, there are two main ways. We personalize the interview and develop and communicate empathy. So how do we personalize the interview? We use the source's name a lot, repeat statements, so they say something, we repeat what they've said, use follow-up questions, talk about ourselves a little bit. How do we communicate empathy? We have a non-judgmental approach towards them, maintain eye contact, display interest through things like forward lean, nodding our head, so on and so forth. Engaging in active listening skills, and making verbal statements that we understand their situation. Now these researchers here, they reviewed 47, they looked at a bunch of interrogation techniques that were actually used. In fact, they looked at 824 techniques. And they divided them in a bunch of categories. One category was rapport and relationship building. And you see some of these other categories like presenting the source with evidence, collaborating with the source to get information versus confronting the source, using tactics that incite emotion within the source, and manipulating the context. Now what we see is that rapport, according to their model they developed, rapport took a central focus, a central importance, and this kind of illustrates how rapport lays the foundation for the interview and interacts with all of these other techniques that an interviewer might use. Now they said that these were the things that interviewers did to build rapport. They found common ground or shared experiences. That's a big thing because people tend to feel more rapport with you if they think you are more similar to them. Show kindness and respect, identify and meet their basic needs, be patient, allow the source to play the role of teacher, so the interviewer takes a one-down approach, build a bond, present the self in a role or persona other than interrogator, touch source in a friendly manner, although we want to be careful with that one, find identities in common, attempt to become the source's lifeline, make yourself appear similar to the source, show concern for the source in his or her situation, so here we got the empathy again, use similar language as the source, and employ active listening skills. And they found that these rapport building behaviors were actually used more often than techniques in those other categories. They also found that when the source provided a full or partial admission, that occurred most often when the interviewer was using rapport building behaviors versus some of these other techniques in the other categories. Another group of researchers, these guys studied, they looked at interviews done with terrorist suspects in Scotland, and they looked at the interviewer behaviors and identified some behaviors that they thought were indicative of rapport, things like acceptance of the source, we talked about that earlier, empathy, so we see empathy coming up again and again, adaptation, where they were adapting to the source's responses rather than making the source adapt to them. Evocation, where they drew out the beliefs and views of the source. And autonomy, where they respected the source's right to choose whether or not to reveal information. They also used some specific rapport building skills, such as reflective listening, where you kind of reflect what the source is saying. Responded to resistance without judgment, summarizing the source's statement, and developing discrepancies where they pointed out inconsistencies in the source's statement. So what they found was that the more that these behaviors were used, the more information was provided by the source. And a follow-up study was done this time it actually was with convicted terrorists. And these behaviors were associated with a reduction in the use of counter-interrogation strategies by those sources. So those individuals were not trying to engage in behaviors that would be kind of a subtle form of resistance. So as an overview of this research, we have to be aware that this research is really still in its infancy. It's a new area of research. There's not been a lot of studies done. Although, again, the government has taken a huge interest in this and has been more and more wanting to fund studies of rapport building in interviews. That my study on the developing the measure of rapport was actually funded by the federal government. Models of rapport must be tested. There's not a lot of testing that's been done because this is so new. Also, specific rapport building behaviors must continue to be tested. What is it that the interviewer does specifically that works to bring about rapport? Also, we know that interrogation and interviewing is not a one-size-fits-all. We have different sources that come in the door. We have different types of interviews that we're conducting. How do we adapt our rapport-building behaviors to these different sources or these different contexts? Furthermore, a lot of times, since these rapport-building behaviors are really embedded parts of certain interviews, how do we know it's the rapport-building and not other aspects of the interview that is having a positive effect? We still need to kind of tease that out with research. Anyone have questions about rapport before I move on? Who's received training in rapport building? Yeah, so a few of you have, not very many though, right? So this is it's a big issue. Again, I think it's talked about. You need to build rapport, but it's not really emphasized how you go about doing that, or at least not more than a few minutes is typically, I think, spent on it. Okay, so we're going to move to another type of interview method that has been supported by research, and it's a really interesting new method. So who's heard of elicitation? Who uses elicitation in here? It's probably not used as much in a law enforcement setting. It's going to be typically used more in a intelligence setting, because we are trying to, with elicitation, we're trying to avoid allowing the source to know what we want to know. So for counterintelligence kinds of purposes. But, so let me just start by talking about Hans Scharf. Hans Scharf was an interrogator for Germany during World War II. He worked as an intelligence, he worked in an intelligence center where he interrogated hundreds of Royal Air Force and U.S. Air Force pilots. Prior to the war, he was a businessman with no interrogation training. He developed a reputation of using non-coercive means of obtaining information from these pilots. He often treated them as old friends and held genuine respect for them. He was able to obtain much information from the pilots through elicitation. Now, the crux of elicitation is that the source is not able to discern the intelligence requirements. They don't know what it is you want to know. And that the source doesn't realize that they have provided you with valuable information. So, Scharf actually moved to the U.S. after the war. If you've ever been to the Disney World, the Cinderella's castle at Disney World, the mosaic inside the castle, he did that. It's, I think, pretty cool. Anyway, he would meet up with some of these U.S. Air Force pilots, who loved him, by the way, and they would ask him, "What did you get out of me? What did I tell you that was useful?" Because they still didn't know. They still didn't know what they told him. That's how good he was at this. So based upon the based upon Hans Scharf method of interviewing, has been developed the Scharf technique, which has been tested in a series of research studies. This interview method is intended to counter the three things that a source who's being interviewed might tell himself. I will not tell them much. I will try to figure out what they are after. It is meaningless to hold back what they already know. So if I know as a source know that they already have information, then why am I going to not tell them the information they already have? Okay. So there are 5 components to the Scharf technique. The first is the interviewer maintains a friendly approach. So much of Scharf's success likely depended on his winsome personality and ability to develop rapport with the sources. It's made it easier for the sources to talk and to give him information beyond name, rank, and serial number. He typically expressed great respect for the pilot's accomplishments and bravery. So this friendly approach helps with the "I will not tell them much." Next, the interviewer doesn't pressure the source for information. This would defeat the purpose of elicitation, because it's important that the source doesn't know what information is being sought. It also makes it easier for the source to talk about other topics, which can give the interrogator cues as to their interests, identity, knowledge. They can use that against them. So this also contributes to the illusion that the interviewer is not interviewing the source, but merely having a discussion. and this might cause the source to slip and provide information he would not normally provide. So not pressing for information helps with the I will not tell them much. It also helps with the I will try to figure out what they are after. If we don't ask them questions, they don't know what we're after. The next component is that the interviewer maintains the illusion of already knowing all of the information being discussed with the source. Okay, so Scharf was really good at gathering information, and he developed a database as much as you could do that before computers, and he had tons of information at his disposal. So when a new pilot came in, he was able to even tell them about themselves. He would say, look, I got this magazine, Stars and Stripes, and here you are with your buddy, so-and-so, who I interviewed last week, by the way. And so he was able to use this information and convince the source that he knew everything. Now, he didn't know everything. He knew some of it. But he bluffed to say, I know everything. The source didn't feel guilty or disloyal about providing information because they thought that Scharf already knew it. Now again, he didn't tell them what he knew so much. He told them little bits, but not everything. So this is important for. It is meaningless to hold back what they already know. If they already know it, why not tell them? And then the interviewer does not ask direct questions, but merely requests that the source confirms or disconfirms information. So they can say something like, for example, well, of course, the downtown mall was a perfect choice for the shooting. Well, if that's not where the shooting was supposed to happen, then perhaps the source would disconfirm that information, or if it was where it was supposed to happen, they might confirm that information. So this then led to, again, I will not tell them much. And last, the last component is that the interviewer ignores new information provided by the source. So when the source does give you something, you don't act all excited about it like you didn't know it. You act like you already knew it. This leads to, again, I will try to figure out what they were after. If they don't know that you already knew this information, or that you didn't already know it. Now, in a series of 4 studies, this is what they have found. That people interviewed using the SHARP technique provided more new information than people interviewed using a direct questioning approach. This is just kind of a very straightforward questioning approach. People interviewed using the SHARP technique perceived the interviewer as having more information than they really did. Whereas people in the direct questioning approach perceive the interviewer as having less information than they really did. People interviewed using the SHARP technique were less able to tell what it was that the interviewer wanted to know, whereas these people were more able to tell what the interviewer wanted to know because they're asking them what they want to know. And the people interviewed using the SHARP technique underestimated the amount of information that they provided to the interviewer, whereas people being interviewed in the direct questioning approach overestimated the amount of information that they provided to the interviewer. So this is what we had. This is the amount of objective, the real information. More information was provided with people participating in the SHARP technique than with the direct approach. This is subjective information. How much do they think they provided? More information was provided in the direct approach. The people in the direct approach thought they provided more information than the people in the SHARP technique. So, and additionally, the participants, this worked, and one study showed that this technique worked best for the sources who were the most resistant. So for those people who were least willing to give it up, this worked the best for them. So one really important part of SHARP's technique was change of scenery, where you manipulate the context or the setting in which an interrogation occurs. Scharf would take prisoners for walks around the compound. He'd take them over to the hospital. He'd give them a beer and a sandwich and talk to them the whole time. And this produced the illusion that the prisoner was no longer being interrogated. Orrin DeForest was a CIA interrogator during the Vietnam War. He did something similar to that. Now, the Reed technique talks about the custodial setting being important, but they talk about it in a very important, different way than change of scenery. Of course, it might be difficult for a police officer to take a suspect in handcuffs for a walk, but particularly with regard to intelligence interviewing, this is something that we're looking into. This hasn't really been tested in research, but I'm actually testing it in the research study that I'm doing. Another really important tactic that, as we've seen, is to confront the source with evidence against them. When we do this, then they're more likely to confess that they're really guilty. And we said that 85% of police officers do this. The important point here is, though, we confront them with true evidence against them, not with false evidence against them. So the question is, when should you confront the source with evidence? Now, according to the FBI method, you confront them with evidence right away, as soon as you begin the interrogation. The problem with that is that if you tell them what you have, if you show them your hand right away, then they're going to be able to now tell you a story that incorporates the evidence you have told them you have, right? So if you say, there was a murder committed in the alleyway, they say they never went into the alley, they were in the store next door to the alley. Well, if you say, we have your fingerprint in the alley, now they can tell you a story that incorporates them going in the alley to feed the homeless guy and then going to the store, right? But if you get their story first and then tell them what information you have, then you can look and see if their story contradicted the evidence you have. And this is what's called the strategic use of evidence technique. So here's a study. We had some guilty and innocent people. Some people, when they were interrogated, the evidence against them was presented at the beginning of the interview. Other people, the evidence was presented later. We first asked them, what's your story? Tell me what happened. And then they ask a few open-ended questions. And then they say, well, this is the evidence we have. So, you get the story about where they were in the store, and then you tell them, it's interesting you say you were never in the alley because we have your fingerprint. So the people who watched these interrogations were better able to classify when someone was lying in the late disclosure interviews. And this was primarily because in the early disclosure interviews, when the evidence was presented early, people omitted information related to the evidence in their story. I'm sorry, when the evidence was presented late, people omitted evidence related to their story, whereas here, people incorporated evidence in their story. This also can elicit statement evidence inconsistencies, which can help us to know when someone is lying. So if they give their story conflicts with the evidence, and then we tell them about the evidence and ask them to explain it, we're going to have more inconsistencies, which are cues that they may be lying. Now, there are a couple of other ways to use this method. One is to combine confrontation about this inconsistency with late disclosure of evidence. That improved the number of admissions to a mock crime. Now, the cognitive interview is an interviewing method that is specifically intended to help people to accurately recall information. It's intended for use with cooperative sources. However, it has been tested with uncooperative sources and seemed to become somewhat effective in overcoming resistance. And so, with the cognitive interview, when you are asking people about their memory, you try to get them to recall details that put the memory in context, and that helps them to remember more. You tell them to report everything, even if it is unimportant, or they think it's unimportant. You tell them to vary their perspective. So you ask them to tell them from the story from their point of view. Now tell me the story from someone else's point of view, and try to see if they can get additional details. We try to get them to tell the story from beginning to end, and then from the end to the beginning, again to get more details. The later versions included rapport building. We tell them to avoid guessing. If you don't know the answer, don't guess. Letting the witness or the source control the chronology of with the interview, the way that the story is being told, rather than the interviewer controlling that. And then using guided imagery to help them to remember. All of these are trying to elicit more and more details from the source. And this cognitive interview has been studied tons and tons of times. It's been shown to increase the number of correct details remembered a whole lot. Also increase slightly, though, the number of incorrect details remembered, but not to affect confabulated or details that people lie about. So it can vastly improve the number of correct details, even if it does increase the number of incorrect details a little bit. Now, we're almost done, I'm sorry, I promise. I want to just distinguish between what we call information, I've alluded to this before, information gathering interviews versus accusatory interviews. And it's important to understand where information gathering methods establish rapport, accusatorial methods establish control. Information gathering methods use positive confrontation. So we're not talking about not using confrontation at all. Confrontation is absolutely necessary to overcome resistance. It's just how do we confront them? Do we confront them or do we use manipulation? Open-ended exploratory questions, closed-ended confirmatory questions. Primary goal is to elicit information. The primary goal is to obtain a confession. Focus on cognitive cues to deception, focus on anxiety cues to deception. So one meta-analysis compared information gathering and accusatory interviews and found that both were more effective than direct questioning and producing confessions in field studies, but we didn't know if those confessions were true or false. In analog studies, information gathering methods were more likely than accusatory methods to produce true but not false confessions. And so information gathering interviews produced more confessions that were more diagnostic. One information gathering method that's used regularly is in England is the peace model of interviewing. Here, again, the goal is to gather information to prosecute a case, not to obtain a confession. And they prohibited all psychological trickery and deception. And they also video record all of their interviews. And so the model is based on a number of steps. First is planning and preparation. This engage and explain phase is where we build rapport and fully explain the suspect's rights. Gaining an account, where you're trying to get their version of events. Closure of the interview, summarizing the interview, and then providing opportunity for follow-up. And then the interviewer is encouraged to evaluate their own performance after each and every interview, and to evaluate the information they obtained and what other information do they need. We won't talk about that. There have been a lot of field studies on this, but they found that when a comprehensive account was gained, it was more likely done when interviewers were more skilled in using these methods. Let's see, we're not going to talk about that. So all of these methods, in order to be successful, require proper interview planning. We need thorough investigation to obtain evidence, because we've seen that disclosure of true evidence to the source is very powerful in obtaining a confession. We need to fully understand the source and tailor the interview method to the source, because interviewing is not one size fits all. We need to change the method depending upon source characteristics. The Reed technique is not really good about that. It's kind of a one-size-fits-all, except with regard to theme development. And to use interview planning to develop topics to explore during the interview. So I'm doing research, as Vic said, for the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group. They fund research. It's housed within the FBI, administratively housed within the FBI. It was established through Obama's executive order, he made second day in office. We provide researchers across the country and in Europe doing research on interviewing methods. And in fact, the Center for Law and Human Behavior manages our grant out of UTEP. And so we're studying some of this change of scenery that we talked about. And we're also studying kind of another method related to the illusion of knowing it all, to see what kind of information we think we're going to be able to get. We think that as we add a new, these are, by the way, approaches used from the Army Field Manual. We think that as we add new approaches in, we're going to get more and more information. We're also going to be measuring their personality and rapport, and see how that interacts with how effective these interview methods are. So just limitations of interrogation research. We have a lot of information about what doesn't work. We don't have much research on what does work. Very little research has evaluated which methods work best with which sources, how to tailor it. And most of this research is done in an analog setting. And we know that there are important differences between interviews conducted in a laboratory setting versus interviews conducted in the real world. And so all of these are differences. And so it's really, really important for researchers to be able to determine if these methods are effective in real world settings. One of the reasons why we haven't been able to do that is because agencies in the intelligence community and federal law enforcement and local law enforcement are often reluctant to allow researchers access to their interviews. And this is often for quite valid reasons. However, if we don't have access, we can't conduct this field research. We can't see if the stuff we found to be useful in the laboratory setting is actually useful in the real world. So some places to start would be to allow researchers to access to training programs, so we can look at role playing that is done between people learning how to conduct interviews, or access to video recordings of interviews in which the case has been adjudicated. These are places to start, and places that might be easier for the agency to allow access.